YouTube, what is good? Welcome back to the channel. We are talking about this camera today. This is the new Lomography Wide Glass camera. This is an instax film camera and it uses instax wide, as the name suggests. And this camera is basically an update to the former version of this camera that existed, which had a plastic lens. Now this has a glass lens, and glass is fantastic for optics. Typically, that's where you're going to get the best quality compared to plastic. And, glass lenses just handle kind of light much better generally, and you get a lot more sharpness typically as well. And that's definitely true of this compared to its predecessor. So getting that out of the way, having glass is definitely going to be better compared to the plastic that was used in the former camera. So let's actually talk about the experience of using this camera. And you know me, I don't like to focus on like all these hard specs and, all that very scientific stuff. I like to focus more on the experience of using this for my particular use cases. I like to do documentary and street portraiture. And in that scenario, I honestly will say I don't think this is a very good camera for that purpose. And there's a couple of reasons why. I think the most important reason is that this camera is kind of sits in the middle between a fully manual camera that's, very mechanical, kind of old school, kind of like the Polaroid 110A, which you see on the screen here. That camera was actually modified to take the Instax lomography back, which is the same back that this camera is built off of. So, they have that in common. But that camera is fully manual, has all the switches, all kind of the old school mechanical things. And I love that. And also you can really control every aspect of it. So that's one side that this camera doesn't really lean towards. The other side that this camera does try to lean towards, but not fully, is the fully automated kind of modern version of a camera, which would have some version of autofocus, fully automated modes like aperture priority, shutter priority, that kind of stuff, or just 100% full shooting auto. This camera does have a full auto mode, which works pretty well, but that is not applying to the lens. The lens is always going to be manual focus, and it's not the typical manual focus. This is zone focusing. So there's 4 different specific zones that have been prescribed on this lens, and you have to pick one of those depending on what you're trying to do with your scene. So when you're focusing at infinity, it's pretty straightforward. Anything that's kind of like 30 feet away or more is probably going to be infinity focus, and therefore you dial that in. But where it gets tricky is with the closer distances. So the next zone over is 1 to 2 meters. And, 1 to 2 meters is kind of easy to estimate, by standing somewhere and just kind of imagining what 3 feet or so looks like. But there's still plenty of room for error there. Plenty of room for error there. And then even closer than that, this camera has a 0.6 and a 0.3. And there you're really guessing. I can't imagine that anybody can nail that over and over and over again with precision. That's tough. And especially if you extrapolate that over a ton of different people, I guarantee you most people are probably going to miss focus and really kind of have a hard time nailing those closer distances. So one thing they could have done with this, similar to what the Pentax camera did, the Pentax half-frame camera, the new one, the strap there actually is an indicator of the macro distance for the minimum focusing distance on that lens. They could have done something similar here, maybe included a longer strap or even just something that you would carry in your pocket that had all the distances marked off on it already, so that if you wanted to get up close to your subject, you could use that as a guide and then you'd be all set. That doesn't happen with this camera, and I think it's a miss because it's a very cheap way to kind of give you a leg up with the zone focusing. So to summarize, this camera sits right in the middle between full automation and full manual control. And that's a very awkward spot for my particular use case. I want to be able to trust the results that I'm going to get and try to minimize wasting film, especially when I'm doing documentary and street style work where you don't really get to repeat the photo. It happens once and that's it. And that moment's gone forever. So if you bring this camera and you do your zone focusing, you might miss focus. Or if you let the camera do full auto, it might overexpose or underexpose. And you can kind of try to guess ahead of time by using the exposure compensation and doing +1 or -1. But still, you're putting a lot of faith and a lot of kind of emphasis on this camera's abilities. And that's just tough. It's not fair really to the camera. So with that said, who do I think this camera actually is well suited for? And I think this camera is actually well suited for a lot of people. If you move away from that, quote unquote, serious style of work where it's documentary, that kind of stuff, and you move to something that's a bit more predictable or casual, then this camera can really shine, especially when you leave it in full auto mode. If you're just looking to have a good time, bring this on vacation or to a party or just hanging out with friends, you can take some really cool photos with this camera, especially if you're willing to kind of sacrifice a few shots while you dial in your distances for the manual zone focusing. Separate from that, if you're kind of doing a portrait shoot and you have a lot of time and you can control everything, you can really take your time in trying to nail the focus as well, and also nail the exposure. You can see kind of how the camera responds after 1 or 2 shots, and then you can adjust and kind of change what you're doing from there to get exactly what you want. But you can see those use cases are very different from being out on the streets, doing something that puts you in an environment where you have zero control over anything. And that's really tough. In this day and age, I would love to see a company, whether it's Lomography or even Fuji themselves. And I know Mint actually created something like this, but to create a Polaroid i2 style camera, you know, all those functionality, all those bells and whistles, but using Instax wide film, that camera would sell very well, especially because Instax wide film is very affordable. It's priced perfectly. So I really think that that's something that somebody should try to do because there's a huge market for it. Polaroid is doing quite well now with the i2 and also with their new emulsion. Instax film is extremely kind of plentiful. It's easy to get. The Instax wide film performs pretty well when you really dial in your exposure. And it can be really sharp if you have a sharp lens to focus your image onto. So, you know, we're waiting for that camera. Lomography clearly wasn't going for that with this. This camera's about $250, which is pretty cheap considering what you might try to achieve with a more expensive camera. So, you know, that's not this camera, but hopefully somebody does it. A couple specific things I don't like about this camera. And before I mention them, go watch Ben's video in an instant. His video is very in-depth, a lot of specs, a lot of really particular information that I think a lot of you really want, and therefore you should check it out. But a couple things I don't like about this camera. First and foremost is the flash is basically always on by default. So you have to turn it off every time you power on the camera. And that's very frustrating. I can't tell you how many times I used flash outdoors or in a situation where there was kind of like relatively enough light and I wanted to maintain that contrast in the scene. The flash, boom, killed it. So that's very frustrating. The viewfinder here is also very frustrating. As you can see here, it's off to the side. And that just really kind of, you know, drastically exaggerates a bit of that parallax you need to deal with. I also don't like the lines in there. I just think it's kind of cheap. And it's also not very user-friendly. It doesn't really set you up for success in trusting that what you're looking through there and how you kind of compose is going to be the composition you get on your actual image. So that's a bit tough. I do like the exposure compensation controls that are on this camera. You have +1 or -1. And I think for Instax film or instant film in general, that's especially key because those films are very finicky. So even when you have an automated kind of exposure and you set the camera to fully automatic, you still want to be able to kind of give it that extra push in either direction, depending on what the user sees in front of you. So that's very, very important. I'm glad they included that. Instax wide as a film is just, like I said earlier, it's a really fun film to use. That big image is really useful. It's also got that kind of 2x3 orientation, which is very different from the Polaroid, which is just square. So, you know, you get kind of the added value of making more interesting looking compositions that are already cropped for you. And the film does have limited dynamic range, whether it's the color or the black and white, but I think it kind of makes up for that limited dynamic range with a lot of sharpness. If you expose that film with a sharp lens, especially when you stop down your lens to, you know, f/16, stuff like that, you're going to get really, really sharp images, which is really beautiful to see. So, you know, I don't want to dog this camera because it was designed for a very specific purpose. Clearly, this wasn't supposed to be some super expensive, fully featured camera, and that's fine. But it does leave me wanting some more. And hopefully that more comes eventually because there's a huge gap right now. There is no Instax camera that has all of the bells and whistles of modern kind of tech with full manual control as well. The Mint camera gets pretty close, but I didn't really like the lens on the Mint camera, especially when shot wide open. I thought it kind of lacked a lot. So we'll see what happens, but you know, there's still time and hopefully somebody puts the money behind that kind of project because I definitely would be interested in that. And I think a lot of my peers would as well. All right, let me know what you think. Am I being a little harsh here or do you think my perspective is useful here? Let me know in the comments. All right, y'all, to the next video. I'm out.